When the Apostle Paul and the Gospel writer Luke and some other missionaries were on their way back to Jerusalem, they stayed at the house of Philip the Evangelist. Not the Philip who was one of the 12 disciples turned apostles, but the Philip who was among the 7 reputable believers who were chosen to oversee the distribution of charity to the widows so that the apostles could focus on other things. The Philip who fulfilled that role and was also someone who told people about Jesus with miracles. The Philip whom God put on the road south of Jerusalem to meet an Ethiopian eunuch and explain Isaiah 53 to him and baptize him and miraculously disappear. That Philip. While at Philip the Evangelist's house, the Apostle Paul and the Gospel writer Luke met his family, and Luke, the writer of the book of Acts, tells us that Philip had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. He had 4 daughters who were not married, but who were prophetesses. An apostle is someone who is sent. The apostles were sent directly by Jesus. A disciple is someone who is taught. The disciples were taught directly by Jesus. An evangelist is someone who evangelizes, someone who preaches the gospel. Philip the evangelist was told at least once to preach the gospel by Jesus. A prophet is someone who speaks for God. The prophets spoke for God and wrote what they spoke, and what they spoke and wrote points to Jesus. The Apostle Paul wrote, "So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers," in Ephesians 4. What I'm saying is this. Without any other information about them or their prophesying, we have to assume that the 4 unmarried prophetess daughters of Philip were 4 unmarried prophetesses because Jesus wanted them to be, right? Right. But how? Because we know that God has in mind distinct roles for men and women. We know that headship in the household and in the church belongs to godly men, and that godly women are called to help them. And that's why we don't have female pastors, because our pastors are called to have authority in a way that God reserves for godly men. And so without any other information about them or their prophesying, we have to assume that the 4 unmarried prophetess daughters of Philip were 4 unmarried prophetesses in a way that did not violate these principles. They did it in a way that helped those in authority without taking authority for themselves. They did it in a way that modeled godliness in the roles assigned by their sex in a way appropriate to the understanding of gender in their culture. They did it with their heads covered, as Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 11. They did it in quietness and full submission, as Paul says in 1 Timothy 2. They did it with purity and reverence and the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, as Peter says in 1 Peter 3. They did what is right and did not give way to fear, like he also says. But how specifically? I don't know. And what's more is I'm a man and a husband and a father and a pastor, so I spend my time trying to figure out how to be those things, how to live those roles that are assigned to me by my sex, and to do it in ways appropriate to the understanding of gender in my culture. And do you think I have that perfectly figured out? Of course not. And I'm supposed to tell women like Philip's 4 daughters how to speak for God in their roles as women? Actually, no, I'm not. I'm actually not supposed to tell anybody exactly how to do anything, not even as their pastor or father or husband, certainly not as a man they only know because they occasionally listen to his podcast, and definitely not if they are Philip's daughters and, I assume, already knew how to do whatever they did in the way that was right for them. Paul and Peter spoke for God when they wrote what they did about the roles of men and women. Through them, God gave us principles to follow, but not a lot of clear lines in the sand. Pastor is a role that requires exercising authority in a way that God has clearly assigned to men. Prophet is one that has a much broader job description. There must be a way to be a godly woman and a prophet. Philip's daughters must have found it. And the looking for it must be what God wants for us, right? For women, for men, for everyone, taking God's principles and applying them and finding the right way to do the jobs God has given us as individuals, looking for ways to point to Jesus, considering the gifts we have and the limitations and the roles assigned to each of us by sex, and in ways appropriate to our culture's understanding of gender, or maybe deliberately inappropriate to what culture tells us when culture goes against what God clearly says. There's freedom in that. Freedom to be myself and a Christian. Freedom to serve God in the way that I can, rather than worrying about some service that seems better somehow, but to which I'm not suited. And freedom to figure that out for me and not feel like I need to tell other people exactly how to figure it out for them. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. The Apostle Paul said that too. And maybe he saw that in action in Philip's daughters. I think we have to assume he did. No, we don't have to. But we can. So let's assume they lived the freedom they found in the gospel their dad preached, and Luke wrote, and Paul preached and wrote, and you and I have also found in their preaching and writing, in their prophesying. And that we would have found in the prophesying of Philip's 4 unmarried prophetess daughters had we had the chance to hear it. Let's assume they lived the freedom we live and found in that freedom a way to be themselves within God's principles and to be free. And let's assume that you and I can do the same. And if we assume all that, then Philip's 4 unmarried prophetess daughters have spoken for God to us in the role assigned to them by their sex and appropriate to their gender, just like Jesus wanted them to. You and I are dust and breath, loved by God, bought by Jesus. This podcast is written and produced by me, Ethan Cherney, a WELS pastor serving Bethel Lutheran Church of Menasha, Wisconsin. Get in touch on Facebook at Dust and Breath Pod, on Twitter at Dust Breath Pod, or by emailing dustandbreathpod@gmail.com. Outro music arranged and performed by Mr. Peter Shawi, who is like the morning sun shining ever brighter to the light of full day. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you could leave a review in iTunes or just share an episode on social media, I'd really appreciate it. It's the only way other people can find the show. Now, go do what God made you to do. Be who God called you to be. Go see what God can do with dust and breath and faith in Jesus, his Son.